Nobody expected that press conference to change everything. On the surface, it looked like another polished NFL moment, ownership taking the podium, saying the right things, thanking a coach for his effort, and promising fans that better days were ahead. But buried inside Jimmy Haslam's words was something far more revealing. This wasn't just a coach getting fired. This was a line being drawn. A quiet admission that something inside the building had gone completely wrong, and that it had gone wrong for longer than anyone wanted to admit. When Haslam said, 8 wins in 2 years is horrible, it didn't sound like frustration. It sounded like finality. No hedging, no excuses, no softened language, just a blunt assessment that felt less like a reaction to one bad season and more like a verdict on an entire direction. And the way he repeated it, totally unacceptable, not going to continue, made it clear this wasn't about patience running out. It was about belief running out. What made it even more unsettling was what came next. Haslam didn't hide behind the usual owner playbook. He didn't blame injuries. He didn't point to bad luck. He didn't even deflect responsibility. He took it and then immediately shifted the focus to the fans. He talked about frustration. He talked about disappointment. He talked about passion. And when owners start talking directly to fans like that, it's usually because they know the trust is broken. But here, where things get interesting. While the headlines focused on the firing, the real story lived in the contrast. Haslam didn't just explain why one man was gone. He carefully explained why another man was staying. And in doing so, he may have revealed the real power shift happening behind the scenes. Because while one side of the operation was being quietly dismantled, the other was being publicly empowered. That contrast raised a question fans immediately latched onto. If the roster was flawed, why praise the person who built it? And if the talent was there, why were the results so bad? Those two ideas can't exist together without pointing to something uncomfortable in the middle, something structural, something philosophical, something that goes beyond play calls and game plans. And then there's the part no one could ignore, the future. Haslam didn't speak like someone starting over. He spoke like someone correcting a mistake. He talked about timelines. He talked about urgency. He talked about the next 120 days as if they were a window that couldn't be wasted. That's not the language of a rebuild. That's the language of a reset. There's been a lot of buzz online since that moment. Fans dissecting every sentence. Analysts replaying every quote. Rumors swirling about internal disagreements, missed opportunities, and players caught in the middle. And while not everything being said can be confirmed, one thing is clear. This wasn't a normal firing. It was a message. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about Shedeur Sanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. Because when ownership finally speaks this plainly, it's usually not just about the past. It's about who they believe in moving forward and who they no longer do. And once you understand that, the entire season starts to look very different. The moment Jimmy Haslam stepped up to the microphone, the tone felt different. Not tense, not emotional, just firm. The kind of firmness that tells you decisions have already been made and there's no turning back. This wasn't ownership testing the waters or gauging public reaction. This was ownership closing a chapter and doing it in a way that left very little room for interpretation. Haslam opened by doing what owners are expected to do. He acknowledged the situation. He accepted responsibility. But then he went further than most ever do. He didn't hide behind vague language or corporate phrasing. He didn't say the team fell short or didn't meet expectations. He said it plainly. 8 wins in 2 years. Horrible, totally unacceptable, not going to continue. Each phrase landed harder than the last, and none of them sounded accidental. What stood out wasn't just the words themselves, it was how often he repeated them. Repetition in a moment like this isn't filler. It's emphasis. It's a signal. Haslam wanted everyone listening, fans, players, media, and people inside the building, to understand that this wasn't a temporary slump being tolerated. It was a failure that had crossed a line. Then he turned his attention directly to the fans, and that's where the press conference quietly shifted from explanation to confession. He talked about frustration, about hearing from fans, about appreciating their passion. That might sound routine, but owners don't usually speak like that unless they feel the pressure has become unavoidable. It felt like an acknowledgement that the disconnect between what was promised and what was delivered had become impossible to ignore. And yet, even as he accepted responsibility, Haslam didn't spread the blame evenly. He was careful, deliberate. Certain parts of the organization were shielded, others weren't. And that distinction mattered. Because while one side of the operation was being described as unacceptable, another was being described as effective, forward-thinking, and worth trusting. This is where the press conference stopped being about one decision and started becoming about direction. Haslam wasn't just explaining what went wrong. He was redefining what right was supposed to look like. Efficiency, accountability, results. He talked about winning consistently, not in flashes, not sneaking into the playoffs once every few years. Consistency. That word came up for a reason. There was also an urgency baked into everything he said. No talk of patience. No suggestion of a long runway. Instead, he framed the situation like a correction that needed to happen immediately. The implication was clear. Whatever had been happening over the last 2 years wasn't just disappointing, it was dragging the entire organization away from its intended path. Since that moment, fans and analysts have been replaying the press conference frame by frame, reading between the lines, asking what was said, and what wasn't. And while interpretations vary, the core message is hard to miss. This wasn't ownership reacting to outside noise. This was ownership admitting that something fundamental had failed. And once that admission was made publicly, everything else that followed suddenly made sense. What made the press conference truly unsettling wasn't the criticism. It was the praise. Because the way Jimmy Haslam chose to compliment certain parts of the organization ended up saying far more about what he believed had gone wrong than any direct attack ever could. On the surface, it sounded supportive, measured, even optimistic. But when you listened closely, the subtext was impossible to ignore. Haslam didn't just say he believed in the front office. He went out of his way to explain why. He walked through decisions. He highlighted specific moves. He named results. That level of detail matters. Owners don't do that unless they're drawing a clear contrast. And in this case, every positive example quietly raised the same uncomfortable question. If these things were done right, why did everything still fall apart on Sundays? The praise started with efficiency. Haslam talked about free agency, calling it smart and focused rather than flashy. One signing, one impact. The kind of move that signals clarity of vision instead of desperation. He didn't frame it as luck. He framed it as process. And once you frame success as process, failure automatically becomes a process problem too. Then came the draft. Haslam didn't just say it was good, he called it one of the best the organization had ever had. Multiple rookies contributing immediately. Players not just performing, but earning recognition. Again, that's not casual praise. That's ownership publicly saying the talent pipeline was working. And when the pipeline is working but the results aren't, the implication writes itself. He even went further, emphasizing character. Not just good players, but good people. Leaders. Competitors. The kind of language teams use when they believe the foundation is solid, but something above it is misaligned. It felt less like encouragement and more like insulation, protecting one part of the structure while another was being quietly dismantled. What made it feel even sharper was what he didn't say. There was no equivalent breakdown of coaching adjustments, no long explanation of scheme evolution, no defense of in-game decisions, no mention of development timelines or growing pains. The silence there was loud. In a moment where everything else was dissected, that absence stood out. Fans picked up on it immediately. Online discussions lit up with the same observation. This didn't sound like an organization admitting it lacked talent. It sounded like an organization admitting it failed to maximize what it already had. That's a very different kind of indictment, and a much more damning one. There's been speculation since then about internal evaluations, disagreements behind closed doors, and long-running tension over direction. None of that has been officially confirmed. But when ownership speaks this clearly about who they trust and why, it's not hard to see why those rumors gain traction. Because praise, when placed carefully, can function like an accusation without ever nomming the target. And in this case, the message was unmistakable. One side of the building had earned the right to keep moving forward. The other had not. And once that line was drawn publicly, the outcome felt inevitable. As soon as the dust settled from the press conference, one question kept resurfacing. It wasn't asked directly from the podium, but it echoed everywhere else, on talk shows, across social media, and inside fan discussions that ran late into the night. How did things get this misaligned, when the most important position in football was supposed to be the future? There's been a lot of conversation online about the handling of the quarterback room, particularly around Shedeur Sanders. Not accusations, not confirmations, just a growing sense of confusion. From the outside, decisions didn't always line up with expectations, and when expectations and reality drift apart like that, speculation fills the gap. Early in the season, fans noticed inconsistencies, rotations that didn't seem settled, timing that felt off, development paths that looked unclear. None of that proves intent, but it does raise questions, especially when those same questions keep coming up week after week. Quarterback development is about rhythm, trust, and continuity. When any of those pieces feel unstable, people start wondering why. What made the situation harder to ignore was the context. This wasn't a roster stripped bare of talent. Ownership later made that clear. There were young players contributing, draft picks producing, pieces in place, which naturally led to another layer of discussion. If the foundation existed, why did the most important position still feel unsettled? Some analysts have suggested that system fit played a role. Others believe timing and patience were factors. And then there are fans who think the situation was mishandled from the start. Again, none of that has been officially stated by the organization. But when multiple narratives form around the same point, it usually means something didn't feel right in real time. The press conference didn't name names, but it didn't need to. When Haslam talked about consistency and accountability, many interpreted that as a subtle nod to development, not just game day results. And in the modern NFL, development almost always circles back to the quarterback. There's also the human side that gets overlooked. Young quarterbacks don't develop in a vacuum. They rely on protection, communication, and belief. When those elements feel shaky, it's not just about wins and losses, it's about confidence. That's why the conversation shifted so quickly from play calling to philosophy. Since then, rumors have continued to swirl. Some reports claim there were internal disagreements over direction. Others suggest there was frustration on multiple sides. None of that has been confirmed, but the persistence of those stories says a lot about how visible the disconnect felt from the outside. And that's why this question refused to go away. Not because anyone was looking for a scapegoat, but because the quarterback represents alignment. When that alignment breaks, it exposes everything else. By the time the press conference ended, the decision had already been made. But for many fans, the real takeaway wasn't about who was fired. It was about who needed clarity moving forward. And whatever happens next, that clarity will start and end with the quarterback. One of the most revealing moments of the press conference didn't come with raised voices or dramatic pauses. It came in a calm, almost casual admission, the kind that owners rarely make unless they believe the consequences are already unavoidable. When Jimmy Haslam addressed the Deshaun Watson trade, he didn't deflect. He didn't reframe it. He said exactly what many around the league already understood, but few inside the organization had openly acknowledged. He admitted that giving up that level of draft capital changed everything. 3 high picks plus additional assets gone. And with that, the flexibility to build depth, to correct mistakes quickly, to absorb injuries, all significantly reduced. That kind of honesty matters because it reframes the entire timeline of the past few seasons. It wasn't just about execution. It was about constraints. In the NFL, draft capital is oxygen. When you lose it, every other decision becomes more expensive. Development timelines stretch. Margin for error disappears. Coaching in that environment becomes even more critical. You don't get many chances to miss. And when you do, the impact compounds fast. What made Haslam's admission so significant wasn't just that he said it was when he said it. This wasn't a defense offered during the trade itself or in the immediate aftermath. This was ownership acknowledging, in hindsight, that the move limited what the team could become. That kind of reflection almost never happens publicly unless it's part of a larger explanation. Naturally, the conversation shifted. If the roster was constrained, then maximizing what remained was essential. Development mattered more. Efficiency mattered more. Adaptability mattered more. And that's where the scrutiny intensified. Because admitting the roster was depleted also raises the bar for how the remaining resources were used. Some analysts have pointed out that teams in similar situations lean heavily on development and scheme creativity. Others argue that when capital is gone, cohesion becomes the most valuable asset. Again, those are interpretations, not official positions. But they became part of the conversation the moment Haslam acknowledged the limitation. The admission also complicated the narrative around responsibility. It would have been easy to frame the trade as an excuse. Haslam didn't. He framed it as a reality. And realities don't absolve performance, they contextualize it. That distinction matters because it suggests ownership wasn't looking for a shield. They were looking for an explanation. Since then, fans have debated what that admission really means. Some believe it softens the failures of the past 2 seasons. Others believe it does the opposite, that it highlights how critical every remaining decision was and how costly misalignment became under those conditions. What's clear is this: once ownership acknowledged the ripple effects of that trade, it became impossible to evaluate the last 2 years in isolation. Everything was connected. Every missed opportunity felt heavier. Every stalled development cycle more damaging. And in that light, the decision that followed didn't feel sudden at all. It felt inevitable. That question didn't come from fans first. It came from ownership. And once Jimmy Haslam addressed it directly, it reframed the entire season in a way that made the results feel even harder to ignore. When asked whether the roster was good enough to win more games, he didn't hesitate. He didn't qualify it. He didn't soften it. He said yes. That single word carried weight, because saying the roster was good enough means the losses weren't inevitable. It means the record wasn't prewritten. And it means the gap between expectation and outcome wasn't about talent alone. In the NFL, that's one of the strongest indictments an owner can make without naming names. From the outside, the roster always felt complicated. Not elite across the board, but not empty either. Young players stepping up. Draft picks contributing earlier than expected. Veterans still capable of producing. There were flashes, just enough to suggest the ceiling was higher than the final numbers showed. And flashes are dangerous because they raise questions. If the talent wasn't the issue, then what was? Execution, preparation, communication. Those are uncomfortable areas to explore, especially when they persist over multiple seasons. One-off failures happen. Patterns don't happen by accident. Haslam's answer pushed that conversation into the open. By acknowledging that more wins were possible, he essentially removed the most common defense, that the team simply wasn't built to compete. That defense only works when ownership buys into it. In this case, they didn't. Analysts quickly picked up on the implication. When rosters underperform relative to expectations, the spotlight shifts upward, not to individuals on the field, but to structure, philosophy, alignment. That's where seasons are really won or lost. There's also the psychological side. Players know when a roster is capable. They feel it in practice. They see it on film. When results don't match that belief, frustration builds, confidence erodes. Small mistakes turn into big ones. Momentum disappears. And once that cycle starts, it's hard to stop without a reset. Some fans have argued that injuries and circumstances still mattered. That's fair. Every season has them. But Haslam's statement suggested those factors weren't enough to explain the gap. Not fully. And when ownership reaches that conclusion, it usually means internal evaluations have already taken place. Since then, there's been quiet debate about how much potential went untapped, about moments that could have swung differently, about decisions that looked fine in isolation but damaging in combination. None of that has been officially confirmed, but it doesn't need to be. The record already tells part of the story. Ownership just told the rest. Because saying the roster was good enough isn't just commentary. It's accountability. It's a way of saying the bar wasn't met, not because it was too high, but because it wasn't reached. And once that belief settles at the top, change isn't a possibility anymore. It's a requirement. When Jimmy Haslam started talking about the next 120 days, the language shifted again. This time, it wasn't about disappointment or frustration. It was about control, timelines, authority. The kind of details owners only share when they want it known that the direction has been decided, and the structure behind it has changed. He didn't describe the off-season as open-ended. He described it as critical, a window, one that couldn't be wasted. And that framing matters because rebuilds don't usually come with deadlines. Corrections do. What Haslam outlined sounded less like starting over and more like recentering the organization around a clear hierarchy and a specific plan. At the center of that plan was power, who has it and who doesn't. Haslam made it clear that the head coach search would begin immediately, and more importantly, who would lead it. Andrew Barry, not a committee, not an outside consultant, the general manager. That alone told fans everything they needed to know about where trust now lives inside the building. When a GM is empowered to choose the head coach, it signals alignment. Philosophy at the top dictates everything below it. Scheme, personnel, development. The days of overlapping authority and blurred lines are over when ownership draws that line publicly. And Haslam didn't hesitate to draw it. He also laid out resources, 10 draft picks, premium selections, flexibility in free agency, optionality in trades. Those aren't guarantees, but they are opportunities, and opportunities mean expectations. You don't highlight resources unless you expect them to be used efficiently. The emphasis on really good players and really good people returned again, reinforcing that this reset isn't just tactical. It's cultural. That phrase has become more than a compliment. It's a filter. It suggests that whoever comes next has to fit into an already defined vision, not reshape it from scratch. There's been speculation about what this means in practice. Some believe it points toward a more development-focused coaching hire. Others think it signals a system built around continuity and stability rather than constant reinvention. None of that has been confirmed, but the structure Haslam described limits the range of possibilities, and that's the point. The urgency of the 120-day window also hints at something else. This isn't a long grace period. Whoever steps into the new role will be expected to align immediately, to maximize what's already in place, to operate within a framework that ownership clearly believes should have produced better results sooner. Fans have debated whether this approach is risky or overdue, but from ownership's perspective, it's decisive. The reset isn't about tearing everything down. It's about removing friction, simplifying authority, and making sure that when decisions are made, everyone is pulling in the same direction. Because in the NFL, misalignment doesn't just slow progress, it erases it. And for the first time in a long time, the structure moving forward feels intentional, not reactive. When everything is stripped away, the quotes, the press conference, the speculation, what's left is a moment of transition. Not the dramatic kind filled with fireworks and slogans, but the quiet kind that reshapes an organization from the inside out. This wasn't just the end of a tenure. It was the end of a way of thinking. The firing didn't feel impulsive, and that's what made it more significant. It felt studied, accumulated, like a conclusion ownership had reached long before it ever went public. By the time Jimmy Haslam spoke, the evaluation was already done. The press conference wasn't about deciding, it was about explaining. What changed most wasn't who left, but who stayed. Trust was redistributed. Authority clarified. The future no longer feels divided between competing philosophies. Whether that leads to success remains to be seen, but the direction is unmistakable. There's now a single vision at the top, and everything beneath it will be judged by how well it aligns. Fans have been quick to assign meaning to every detail, and that's understandable. When a season ends like this, people look for villains, heroes, and shortcuts to certainty. But the reality is more nuanced. This era shift isn't about blaming one person for everything that went wrong. It's about ownership deciding what it believes will work and committing to it fully. There's also an undercurrent of urgency that can't be ignored. The language wasn't patient. It wasn't cautious. It suggested that the window matters now, that progress needs to be visible, that the next chapter won't be measured in promises, but in execution. That kind of pressure can break organizations or finally focus them. The most important takeaway is this: the past 2 years aren't being treated as an anomaly. They're being treated as evidence that something fundamental needed to change. And once ownership views history through that lens, there's no going back. The off-season ahead will bring headlines, hires, and heated debate. Every move will be dissected, every quote scrutinized. But those are just surface-level moments. The real shift has already happened. It happened the moment ownership publicly redefined what was acceptable and what wasn't. Whether this reset leads to long-term success or another chapter of frustration will depend on execution. But one thing is clear: the organization isn't drifting anymore. It has chosen a direction, a structure, and a standard. And in a league where indecision can be just as damaging as failure, that alone marks the beginning of a new era.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.